The year was 1847, and the muddy streets of Independence, Missouri buzzed with the chaos of westward expansion. Wagon trains formed daily, families sold everything they owned for a chance at California gold, and desperate people made desperate bargains. But among all the transactions that took place in that frontier town, none would prove more significant than the moment when 17-year-old Eliza Whitmore was sold for $5 to a stranger who saw something in her that no one else could see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would transform not just two lives, but an entire frontier community, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can forge the strongest bonds, and that true worth has nothing to do with what others see on the surface. Eliza Whitmore had known hunger longer than she'd known kindness. Standing in the corner of Jeremiah Blackwood's cramped general store, her thin frame barely filled the worn calico dress that hung loose around her shoulders. The fabric, once a cheerful yellow, had faded to the color of old parchment and careful. Patches marked where tears had been mended with whatever scraps could be found. Her face told the story of 17 hard years. A childhood bout with smallpox had left her skin pocked and scarred, while malnutrition had kept her small and slight. Her left eye drooped slightly from an old injury, and her brown hair hung limp and unwashed around her angular features. The townspeople of Independence had long ago decided that Eliza Whitmore was unfortunate to look upon, and they made sure she knew it. "Ugliest girl this side of the Mississippi," they'd whisper when she passed. "Poor thing, probably never find a husband." Their words cut deeper than any physical hardship she'd endured. Blackwood paced behind his counter, his heavy boots creating a rhythm of anxiety on the wooden floor. The man who owned her indenture contract was desperate. Debts had mounted faster than his ability to pay them, and creditors circled like vultures. The store that had been his pride was now his prison, and Eliza represented one of his few remaining assets. "She's strong enough," Blackwood muttered to the small crowd gathered in his store that Tuesday morning. "Works without complaint, knows her letters and numbers. Someone could get good use out of her." The men examined her like livestock. Samuel Rodriguez, a local farmer, walked around her in a slow circle, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "She's awfully thin, Jeremiah. Looks like she might blow away in a strong wind." "And that face," added Morton Hayes, the town blacksmith, not bothering to lower his voice. "Hard to look over the breakfast table every morning." Eliza kept her eyes fixed on a water stain in the corner of the ceiling, a trick she'd learned years ago to remove herself from moments like these. She imagined herself somewhere else entirely, perhaps in one of the books she'd secretly learned to read by candlelight, sailing across vast oceans or walking through English gardens where no one knew her story. The bidding started at $2. Rodriguez raised it to $3 for the labor value alone. Hayes shook his head and walked away, muttering about better investments. A traveling merchant offered $3.50, but only if she came with a month's worth of provisions. $4, called a voice from the back of the store. The crowd turned to see Thomas Mackenzie emerge from behind a display of farming tools. He was a large man, tall and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work and an honest living. His brown hair was streaked with premature gray at 32, and his blue eyes held a steadiness that made people trust him instinctively. Mackenzie owned a modest ranch about 60 miles west of Independence, closer to the true frontier where the land was still wild and unforgiving. $4.50, Rodriguez countered, unwilling to lose to an outsider. Mackenzie stepped closer to where Eliza stood. Unlike the others, he didn't circle her or examine her like merchandise. Instead, he spoke directly to her. "What's your name, miss?" "Eliza Whitmore, sir," she replied, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "Can you read, Eliza?" "Yes, sir, and write, and do sums." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Most indentured servants couldn't claim such skills. $5, Mackenzie said firmly, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face. The room fell silent. $5 was more than most expected the girl to fetch, and Rodriguez knew when he was beaten. Blackwood's relief was palpable as he quickly accepted the offer, eager to close the deal before Mackenzie changed his mind. Money changed hands, papers were signed, and just like that, Eliza's life took another unexpected turn. Mackenzie gathered her few possessions, a change of clothes, a worn shawl, and a small bundle of personal items, and led her outside to where his wagon waited. The journey to his ranch would take 3 days across increasingly wild terrain. As they rolled out of Independence, Eliza watched the familiar buildings fade behind them, unsure whether she was heading toward salvation or simply exchanging one form of servitude for another. Mackenzie proved to be a man of few words during those first hours on the trail. He handled the reins with practiced ease, navigating ruts and rocks while keeping a steady pace. Eliza sat beside him on the wagon seat, acutely aware of how different this man was from anyone she'd known. He didn't stare at her scars or make cruel observations about her appearance. He simply treated her like a person, which was more consideration than she'd received in years. "Tell me about yourself, Eliza," he said as they made camp that first evening beside a small creek. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "What would you like to know, sir?" "Whatever you're comfortable sharing. How did you end up indentured to Blackwood?" The story came slowly, painfully. Her parents had died of fever when she was 12. With no relatives able to take her, she'd been bound over to Blackwood to work off the cost of her care. 5 years of cleaning, cooking, mending, and enduring the casual cruelty of customers who saw her as nothing more than an unfortunate fixture in the store. "I'm sorry," Mackenzie said simply when she finished. "That's been a hard road for someone so young." They were the kindest words anyone had spoken to her in years, and Eliza had to blink back tears. The second day brought them into a more rugged country. Rolling hills gave way to steeper terrain, and the signs of civilization grew fewer. Mackenzie pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the land, treating Eliza like a companion rather than property. He told her about his ranch, how he'd built it from nothing after arriving in Missouri 7 years earlier. "It's not much to look at yet," he admitted. "Just a cabin, a barn, and enough cleared land for crops and grazing. But it's honest work, and the land has potential." "Why did you come west?" Eliza asked, growing bolder as his kindness continued. Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment. "My wife died back in Ohio," he said finally. "Childbirth. Lost the baby too. Seemed like everything familiar just reminded me of what I'd lost. Though maybe out here, I could build something new." His pain was evident in the careful way he spoke about it, and Eliza felt a kinship with this man who had also known loss and loneliness. That evening, as they sat by their campfire under a canopy of stars, Mackenzie surprised her again. "I want you to know, Eliza, I didn't buy your contract to have a servant. I need help with the ranch, that's true, but I believe in paying fair wages for fair work. Soon as you've worked off what I paid for you, you'll be free to go wherever you choose. And if you decide to stay, we'll work out proper wages." Eliza stared into the flames, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You mean I won't be indentured?" "Not any longer than it takes to square the debt. Month or 2 at most, way I figure it." For the first time since childhood, Eliza felt something stirring in her chest that might have been hope. They reached Mackenzie's ranch on the 3rd day, just as the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees. The property sat in natural valley, protected by low hills and watered by a clear stream that wound through the meadow. The cabin was larger than Eliza had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney and glass windows that spoke of care and planning. The barn was newer, its wood still pale, and beyond it lay fields where corn and wheat grew in neat rows. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, and meant it. Mackenzie seemed pleased by her reaction. "Come on, I'll show you around." The cabin interior was clean but sparse, furnished with handmade pieces that showed Mackenzie's skill with tools. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves lined with books. Eliza's eyes widened at the sight of so many volumes. "You're welcome to read." "Any of them," Mackenzie said, noticing her interest. "Long winter evenings out here. Books are good company." He showed her to a small room off the main living area. "This will be yours," he said. "It's not fancy, but it's private and warm." The room contained a simple bed, a chest for her belongings, and a small window that looked out over the meadow. After years of sleeping on a straw pallet in Blackwood's storeroom, it seemed like luxury. Over the following days, Mackenzie introduced Eliza to the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to milk the cow, gather eggs from the chickens, and tend the vegetable garden behind the cabin. Her small hands proved skilled at delicate work, mending harnesses, preserving food, and keeping accounts of supplies and expenses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What surprised her most was how Mackenzie treated her opinions with respect. When she suggested a more efficient way to organize the root cellar, he listened and implemented her ideas. When she noticed signs of disease in some of the chickens, he trusted her judgment and took steps to prevent its spread. "You've got a good eye for details," he told her one evening as they reviewed the ranch's account books together. "And a head for numbers. That's valuable out here." Slowly, carefully, Eliza began to believe that she might have found something she'd never thought possible, a place where she belonged, where her contributions mattered more than her appearance. But she also began to notice the challenges Mackenzie faced. The ranch was isolated, with the nearest neighbor 15 miles away. Supply runs to town meant days of travel, and every decision carried the weight of survival. Weather could destroy crops, animals could fall sick, and the constant threat of financial ruin loomed over every frontier farmer. More troubling were the visitors who occasionally stopped by. Other ranchers and farmers would eye Eliza with barely concealed disdain, making comments about Mackenzie's unfortunate help or suggesting he could do better for himself. Some were more direct in their disapproval. "That girl's going to hurt your reputation, Tom," warned Jacob Sterling, a neighboring rancher, during one such visit. "People talk, you know. Wonder why a man would keep someone like that around." Mackenzie's response was firm but polite. "Eliza's work speaks for itself. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to their opinion." But Eliza heard the whispers, saw the looks, and understood that her presence was creating difficulties for the man who had shown her the first kindness she'd known in years. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on her shoulders, adding a new dimension to her gratitude and her growing determination to prove her worth. As autumn approached and the first frost touched the meadow grass, Eliza realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. For the first time in her life, she was valued for what she could do rather than judged for how she looked. Mackenzie had given her more than freedom from indenture. He had given her dignity, but she also sensed that their story was just beginning, and that the challenges ahead would test not just her newfound confidence, but the unlikely partnership that had formed between a scarred young woman and the gentle giant who had seen her true worth. When no one else would. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it challenges that would test every skill Eliza had developed and every bond she had formed with Mackenzie. The first blizzard struck in late November, trapping them in the cabin for 5 days straight. While the howling wind piled snow against the windows, Eliza discovered that isolation could be a gift rather than a punishment. She spent those storm-bound days reading Mackenzie's books while he worked on indoor projects, repairing tools, planning improvements for spring, and teaching her skills she'd never had the chance to learn. He showed her how to clean and oil firearms, how to read weather signs, and most importantly, how to keep detailed records that would help them make better decisions about crops and livestock. Knowledge is power out here, Mackenzie explained as they worked by lamplight. The more you understand about this land and how to work with it, the better your chances of not just surviving, but thriving. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to find their world transformed. Snow reached the cabin's eaves in places, and getting to the barn required digging tunnels through drifts taller than Eliza herself. But their preparations had paid off. The animals were safe and well fed, the cabin stayed warm, and their food stores remained intact. More importantly, those long evenings of conversation had deepened their friendship. Mackenzie had shared stories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his apprenticeship to a carpenter, and his dreams of building something lasting on the frontier. Eliza, in turn, had found the courage to speak about her hopes, modest dreams of learning more, of becoming truly useful, of perhaps one day having a place she could call home without qualification. The real test came in January when disaster struck their closest neighbor. Jacob Sterling's barn caught fire during a bitter cold snap, and he lost most of his livestock and winter feed. Word spread quickly among the scattered ranches, and Mackenzie immediately began organizing relief efforts. "We'll take 2 of our cows and half our hay reserves," he told Eliza as they loaded the wagon. "But that leaves us short for the rest of winter," she pointed out, though she admired his generosity. "Sterling's got 3 young children. They need it more than we do." When they arrived at the Sterling place, Eliza expected the usual cool reception she received from other settlers. Instead, she found herself in the middle of a crisis where her skills proved invaluable. While the men worked to construct temporary shelter for the surviving animals, the women struggled to care for Sterling's sick wife and manage 3 frightened children. Martha Sterling was suffering from pneumonia, made worse by smoke inhalation from the fire. The local women meant well, but their remedies weren't working, and panic was setting in. Eliza had learned herb lore from an old woman in Independence, knowledge she'd never had occasion to use until now. "May I?" she asked quietly, approaching Martha's bedside. The women exchanged glances. Finally, Mrs. Henderson, the unofficial leader among the ranchers' wives, nodded. "We've tried everything we know." Eliza examined Martha carefully, noting the congestion in her chest and the fever that wouldn't break. She prepared a poultice using ingredients from her carefully maintained herb collection, mixed a tea that would ease breathing, and showed the others how to create a steam tent to help clear Martha's lungs. More importantly, she organized the chaos that had taken over the Sterling household. She assigned tasks to each woman based on their strengths, created schedules for caring for Martha and watching the children, and established a system for managing the donated food and supplies that neighbors continued to bring. "You certainly know what you're doing," Mrs. Henderson observed as Eliza efficiently directed the preparation of meals for the growing crowd of helpers. "I learned to manage when resources were scarce," Eliza replied simply. Over the next 3 days, Martha's condition improved steadily. The children, initially shy around the scarred young woman, soon discovered that she told wonderful stories and could make even the simplest chores seem like adventures. By the time the crisis passed and the various families began returning to their own homes, something fundamental had shifted in how the community viewed Eliza Whitmore. "I was wrong about that girl," Mrs. Henderson confided to her husband as they prepared to leave. "She's got more sense and capability than winning twice." Her age, Jacob Sterling himself sought out Eliza before she and Mackenzie departed. "I owe you a debt I can't repay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my wife's life and kept my family together when everything was falling apart." "We help each other out here," Eliza replied, unconsciously echoing Mackenzie's philosophy. "That's what neighbors do." But Sterling's gratitude went deeper than words. When they returned to town the following month for supplies, Eliza noticed a change in how people treated her. Where once there had been barely concealed disgust or pity, now there was something approaching respect. The story of her role in saving Martha Sterling had spread, and with it, a growing recognition that Thomas Mackenzie's unfortunate help was neither unfortunate nor merely help. The transformation became more apparent as spring approached. Other ranchers began seeking Eliza's advice on medical matters, herb cultivation, and household management. Women who had previously avoided her company now made excuses to visit the Mackenzie ranch, often bringing their daughters to learn from someone they had come to see as exceptionally competent. "You're becoming quite the local authority," Mackenzie observed with amusement as yet another neighbor stopped by seeking Eliza's counsel. "It feels strange," she admitted. "All my life, people have seen me as something to be pitied or avoided. I'm not sure how to be someone they come to for help." "Just keep being yourself," he advised. "That's what got you here." Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Mackenzie had decided to expand his operation, adding sheep to their cattle and increasing their crop acreage. The work was demanding, requiring skills and knowledge they both had to learn as they went. Eliza threw herself into every aspect of the expansion, from researching the best sheep breeds for their climate to designing more efficient layouts for their expanded gardens. Her talent for organization and planning proved invaluable. She created detailed schedules for planting, harvesting, and animal care. She negotiated with suppliers, finding better prices for seed and equipment than Mackenzie had managed on his own. Most importantly, she began to see patterns and connections that helped them make their operation more efficient and profitable. "You should be keeping books for other ranchers," Mackenzie suggested after reviewing their remarkably detailed and accurate records. "There's probably good money in it." The idea intrigued Eliza, but it also frightened her. Success meant visibility, and visibility had always brought her pain. But Mackenzie's faith in her abilities gave her courage to consider possibilities she'd never imagined. The test came when Marcus Flynn, one of the most successful ranchers in the county, approached them with a proposition. Flynn had heard about Eliza's organizational skills and wanted to hire her to help him resolve problems with his operation. His ranch was much larger than Mackenzie's, but it was losing money despite good land and adequate resources. "I'll pay." "Well," Flynn promised, "and it would only be for a few weeks while you sort out my systems." Mackenzie left the decision entirely to Eliza. "It's your choice," he said. "But I think you should know that Flynn's got a reputation for being particular about appearances. He might not be as accommodating as some folks." Eliza understood the warning, but she also recognized the opportunity. If she could succeed with Flynn's operation, it would establish her credentials beyond question. More importantly, it would prove to herself that her worth truly was independent of her appearance. Flynn's ranch was impressive, hundreds of acres, large herds, and substantial buildings that spoke of prosperity. But Eliza quickly discovered that prosperity wasn't the same as efficiency. The operation was plagued by poor record-keeping, inefficient workflows, and communication problems between Flynn and his workers. Flynn himself proved to be exactly as Mackenzie had warned. He was uncomfortable with Eliza's appearance and made little effort to hide his feelings. His workers, taking their cue from their boss, treated her with barely concealed contempt. "I hope Mackenzie knows what he's doing, sending his help to fix our problems," she overheard one of them say. But Eliza had learned to let her work speak for itself. She began by spending days simply observing, taking notes, and asking questions. She studied their livestock management, crop rotation, financial records, and daily routines. What she found was an operation that succeeded despite itself, held back by inefficiencies that were costing Flynn thousands of dollars annually. Her recommendations were comprehensive and detailed. She proposed new systems for tracking expenses and income, schedules that would reduce waste and improve productivity, and organizational changes that would eliminate redundant work and improve communication. Flynn was skeptical at first, but the numbers were undeniable. Within 2 weeks of implementing Eliza's suggestions, his operation was running more smoothly than it had in years. Costs were down, productivity was up, and for the first time in months, Flynn's book showed a healthy profit margin. The transformation in Flynn's attitude was remarkable. The man who had initially been embarrassed to be seen working with someone of Eliza's appearance became one of her strongest advocates. When other ranchers asked about his sudden improvement in fortunes, he was quick to credit Eliza's expertise. "That young woman has a mind for business that would put most men to shame," he told anyone who would listen. "Mackenzie's lucky to have her, and so was I." Word of Flynn's endorsement spread quickly through the ranching community. Soon, Eliza found herself in demand as a consultant, with requests for her services coming from ranchers throughout the county. What had started as a favor to a neighbor had become the foundation of a new career, but success brought its own complications. As Eliza's reputation grew, so did the attention she received. Some of it was welcome, the respect of people who valued her abilities and the satisfaction of work well done. But other attention was less comfortable. There were those who resented her success, who couldn't accept that someone they had dismissed as worthless could achieve such recognition. More challenging were the questions about her relationship with Mackenzie. As her fame spread beyond their immediate community, rumors began to circulate about the unusual partnership between the respected rancher and his former indentured servant. Some speculated about romantic involvement, others suggested improper business arrangements, and still others simply couldn't understand how such an unlikely pair had found success together. Mackenzie faced his own pressures. Fellow ranchers questioned his judgment in giving so much responsibility to someone they still saw as hired help. Business associates wondered if he was being taken advantage of by a clever woman who had manipulated her way into his confidence. "People are talking, Tom," warned his friend Daniel Morrison during a visit to town. "They're saying that girl has you wrapped around her finger, that she's using you to build herself up." Mackenzie's response was characteristically direct. "Eliza's success reflects well on both of us. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." But the pressure was taking its toll. Both Mackenzie and Eliza could feel the weight of constant scrutiny, the need to prove themselves again and again to people who seemed determined to find fault with their arrangement. The situation came to a head during the county's annual harvest festival, a celebration that brought together families from across the region. It was the largest social gathering of the year, and attendance was virtually mandatory for anyone who wanted to maintain standing in the community. Eliza had been reluctant to attend, knowing that the festival would put her squarely in the spotlight at a time when rumors and speculation were at their peak. But Mackenzie convinced her that avoiding the event would only fuel more gossip. "We have nothing to hide," he argued. "Let people see us as we are, partners who've built something good together through honest work and mutual respect." The festival would indeed prove to be a turning point, but not in the way either of them expected. As they prepared to face the largest gathering of their peers they had ever encountered together, both Eliza and Mackenzie understood that their partnership was about to face its greatest test yet. The harvest festival buzzed with an energy that seemed to crackle in the autumn air. Families from every corner of the county had converged on the town square, their wagons loaded with the fruits of their labor and their finest clothes reserved for this one day when the entire community came together. Tables groaned under the weight of preserved foods, fresh bread, and carefully hoarded delicacies that marked the celebration of another successful growing season. Eliza stood at the edge of the festivities, acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed her movement through the crowd. She wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that Mackenzie had insisted on buying for her during their last trip to Kansas City. The color brought out her eyes and complemented her brown hair, which she had carefully arranged in a style copied from a magazine illustration. But no amount of careful grooming could erase the scars that marked her face or change the features that had drawn cruel comments for so many years. Mackenzie appeared at her side, carrying 2 cups of apple cider and wearing the patient expression that had become familiar whenever he sensed her discomfort in social situations. "The Hendersons are asking about your herb garden," he said, nodding toward a cluster of women near the pie display. "Seems Mrs. Patterson's been having trouble with her medicinal plants." "I'll speak with her," Eliza replied, grateful for the excuse to focus on something productive rather than the undercurrent of speculation that seemed to follow them both. As she made her way toward the group of women, she passed close enough to overhear a conversation between 2 men she didn't recognize. They wore the fine clothes and soft hands of successful merchants, likely visiting from one of the larger towns. "That's her," one was saying to the other, "the one they're all talking about. Hard to believe someone looking like that could have such influence around here." "Mackenzie must be getting something out of the arrangement," his companion replied with a knowing chuckle. "Maybe she's more accommodating than she appears." The casual cruelty of their speculation hit Eliza like a physical blow. For a moment, she felt herself transported back to Blackwood's store, surrounded by men who saw her as nothing more than an object to be evaluated and dismissed. But then she caught sight of Mrs. Henderson waving her over, and she remembered who she had become in the months since leaving Independence. The conversation with Mrs. Patterson and the other women proved to be exactly what Eliza needed. They spoke of practical matters, which herbs grew best in clay soil, how to preserve medicinal tinctures through winter, the best methods for drying and storing therapeutic plants. These women valued her knowledge and sought her advice not despite her appearance, but because they had learned to look beyond surface judgments, to recognize genuine expertise. "You should write down some of these remedies," suggested Mrs. Patterson as Eliza explained how to prepare a poultice for joint pain. "My grandmother kept a book of such things, and it was worth its weight in gold." The idea intrigued Eliza. She had been keeping detailed notes about her herbal experiments and their results, but she had never considered that others might find value in a systematic record of frontier medicine and household management. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main stage where the festival's formal presentations were held. Mayor Hutchins was calling for attention, his voice carrying over the crowd as he announced the beginning of the awards ceremony that recognized outstanding contributions to the community. "This year," the mayor proclaimed, "we have the pleasure of recognizing several individuals whose efforts have made a significant difference in the lives of their neighbors." The crowd gathered around the stage, and Eliza found herself pressed forward by the movement of people, eager to see who would be honored. Mackenzie appeared beside her again, his presence reassuring as they navigated the crush of bodies. The first awards went to predictable recipients: the banker who had extended credit during a difficult harvest, the blacksmith who had donated his services to repair storm damage, the schoolteacher who had organized a successful drive to purchase new books. Each recognition was met with applause and general approval from the assembled crowd. Then Mayor Hutchins paused, consulting his notes with a slight smile. "Our next recognition goes to someone whose contributions might have been overlooked in years past, but whose impact on our community has become impossible to ignore." Eliza felt a growing sense of unease as the mayor's eyes seemed to find her in the crowd. "Miss Eliza Whitmore," he announced, "please come forward." The crowd's reaction was mixed, some applause, some surprised murmurs, and from certain quarters, barely concealed disapproval. Eliza stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and uncertain how to respond. Mackenzie placed a gentle hand on her back. "Go on," he encouraged. "You've earned this." With legs that felt unsteady, Eliza made her way through the parting crowd toward the stage. Mayor Hutchins extended his hand to help her up the steps, and suddenly she found herself facing the largest gathering of people she had ever addressed. Miss Whitmore, the mayor continued, has demonstrated this year that service to community comes in many forms. Her medical knowledge saved Martha Sterling's life during the barn fire crisis. Her organizational skills have helped multiple ranchers improve their operations and increase their prosperity. Her willingness to share knowledge and lend assistance has made her one of our most valuable community resources. The applause that followed was warmer now, though Eliza could still see pockets of resistance in the crowd. Some faces showed genuine appreciation, others polite acknowledgement, and a few revealed the same dismissive attitudes she had faced all her life. But perhaps most importantly, Mayor Hutchins added, Miss Whitmore has shown us all that true worth is measured not by appearances, but by actions. In a frontier community where everyone must contribute their best efforts for all to survive and prosper, she has set an example of dedication and capability that honors us all. As Eliza accepted the engraved wooden plaque that served as the award, she caught sight of the two merchants who had made the cruel comments earlier. Their expressions had shifted from casual dismissal to something approaching embarrassment, and she realized that public recognition had the power to change not just how others saw her, but how they were allowed to speak about her. The ceremony continued with other recognitions, but Eliza barely heard them. She stood at the side of the stage, clutching her award and trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in her life, she had been publicly honored not despite her appearance, but because her contributions were deemed valuable enough to celebrate. After the formal presentations ended, the evening shifted to music and dancing. A small group of musicians had set up near the stage, and couples began forming for the traditional dances that marked the end of harvest season. Eliza retreated to a quieter corner, content to observe rather than participate in activities that had never welcomed someone like her. She was surprised when James Morrison, Daniel's eldest son, approached her with a respectful bow. Miss Whitmore, would you honor me with a dance? The request was so unexpected that Eliza could only stare at him for a moment. James was 25, unmarried, and generally considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the county. His asking her to dance would be noticed by everyone present. I don't dance very well, she stammered, acutely conscious of the attention their conversation was drawing. Neither do I, James replied with a self-deprecating smile. But I figure we can muddle through together. Besides, I wanted to thank you properly for the advice you gave my father about crop rotation. Our yields were up 30% this year because of your suggestions. As they joined the other couples on the makeshift dance floor, Eliza became aware of the shifted dynamics around her. Where once her presence at such an event would have been met with pity or disgust, now she was being treated as a valued member of the community. Other young men asked her to dance, women sought her out for conversation, and even some of the older, more established families made efforts to include her in their social circles. But the most significant moment came when Catherine Wells, the banker's daughter and acknowledged beauty of the county, approached her during a break in the dancing. Miss Whitmore, Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly in the relative quiet, I wanted to tell you how much I admire what you've accomplished. When I heard about your work with the Sterling family and all the ranchers you've helped, it made me realize how little I've done to contribute to our community. The conversation that followed was unlike any Eliza had ever experienced. Catherine, despite her privileged position and natural beauty, spoke with genuine respect about Eliza's achievements and asked thoughtful questions about how she might use her own advantages to make similar contributions. I've been thinking about organizing classes for young women, Catherine explained. Teaching some of the skills that you've mastered, herbal medicine, household management, record keeping. Would you consider helping me develop such a program? The proposal was both flattering and daunting. Working with Catherine would mean taking on a more public role in community education, stepping further into the spotlight that still made Eliza uncomfortable. But it also represented an opportunity to share knowledge that could genuinely improve other women's lives. "I'd be honored to help," Eliza replied, surprised by her own boldness. As the evening wound down and families began preparing for their journeys home, Eliza found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed. The same community that had once seen her as an object of pity or disgust now recognized her as a valued contributor. The knowledge and skills that had developed from necessity and curiosity were now being sought after and celebrated. Mackenzie found her as she stood watching the last of the dancers, her award still clutched in her hands. "Quite an evening," he observed. "I never imagined anything like this could happen," she replied honestly. "This morning I was worried about facing disapproval, and tonight I'm being asked to help teach other women. You've earned every bit of recognition you received tonight," Mackenzie said firmly. "But I hope you realize this is just the beginning. Word about tonight will spread beyond our county. You're going to have opportunities you never dreamed of." His words proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. 3 days after the festival, a stranger arrived at their ranch, a well-dressed woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Mrs. Victoria Ashford from the territorial capital. "I've heard remarkable things about your work, Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Ashford explained as they sat in the cabin's main room. "I represent a group of women who are working to establish educational programs for frontier communities. We're looking for individuals with practical knowledge and teaching ability to help develop curricula for schools across the territory." The offer Mrs. Ashford presented was staggering in its implications. They wanted Eliza to compile her knowledge of frontier medicine, household management, and agricultural planning into formal educational materials. More than that, they wanted her to travel to various communities to train teachers and establish programs that would help other women develop the skills needed for frontier life. "The position would pay well," Mrs. Ashford continued, "and would give you the opportunity to influence the education of women across the entire Tory. Your reputation for practical knowledge and effective teaching has reached us even in the capital." Eliza listened to the offer with growing amazement and mounting anxiety. The opportunity was beyond anything she had ever imagined possible, but it would also mean leaving the ranch that had become her first real home and the man who had made her transformation possible. After Mrs. Ashford departed with a promise to return in a week for Eliza's answer, she and Mackenzie sat in contemplative silence. The decision before them would affect not just Eliza's future, but the partnership they had built together. "It's an incredible opportunity," Mackenzie said finally. "The kind of chance that comes once in a lifetime. But it would mean leaving everything we've built here," Eliza replied, voicing the concern that weighed heaviest on her mind. "We've built something that can't be destroyed by distance," Mackenzie assured her. "You have talents that deserve a bigger stage than one ranch in Missouri. This territory needs what you have to offer." As they discussed the implications of Mrs. Ashford's offer, both Eliza and Mackenzie began to understand that their story was approaching another crucial turning point. The young woman who had been sold for $5 and dismissed as worthless was being courted by territorial authorities, who recognized her value to the entire frontier community. But with opportunity came difficult choices, and the decisions they made in the coming week would determine not just Eliza's future, but the nature of the partnership that had already transformed both their lives in ways neither had thought possible. The week following, Mrs. Ashford's visit passed in a blur of internal struggle for Eliza. Each morning brought fresh arguments for accepting the territorial position, and each evening delivered equally compelling reasons to stay. She found herself pacing the cabin floors during sleepless nights, weighing opportunity against loyalty, ambition against gratitude. Mackenzie gave her space to think, but she could see the conflict in his own eyes. He wanted her to succeed, but she had become integral to both his ranch and his life in ways that went beyond mere business partnership. Their daily routines had evolved into a comfortable rhythm that would be difficult to replicate with anyone else. On the fourth day, an unexpected visitor provided a new perspective on their dilemma. Reverend Samuel Clark arrived on horseback, his black coat dusty from travel and his weathered face showing the strain of a long journey. The circuit preacher visited their area only twice a year, but his timing seemed providential. "Thomas, Miss Whitmore," he greeted them warmly as he dismounted. "I hope you'll forgive the unscheduled visit, but I heard news that brought me here as quickly as possible." They welcomed him inside, and over coffee and fresh bread, Reverend Clark shared what he had learned during his travels through the territory. "Word of your achievements has spread far beyond this county, Miss Whitmore," he began. "I've heard your name mentioned in 3 different settlements, each time with great respect. There's talk that you represent something new on the frontier, a woman who has proven that intelligence and determination matter more than conventional expectations." The Reverend's next words carried weight that surprised them both. "I've been asked by the territorial governor himself to assess whether the stories about you are accurate. There's serious consideration being given to appointing you to the Territorial Education Board, a position that would make you the first woman to hold such an office." Eliza nearly dropped her coffee cup. The Territorial Education Board oversaw all schooling across the vast region, making decisions that affected thousands of families. The idea that someone of her background might be considered for such a role seemed impossible. "But I have no formal education," she protested. "I learned to read and write almost by accident, and everything else came from necessity." "Precisely," Reverend Clark replied. "You've proven that practical knowledge and real-world experience often matter more than formal credentials. The frontier needs leaders who understand the actual challenges families face, not just theoretical principles learned in distant universities." Mackenzie leaned forward, his interest clearly engaged. "What would such a position entail?" "She would help develop educational standards for frontier schools, approve textbooks and curricula, and oversee the training of teachers. Most importantly, she would ensure that education on the frontier prepares young people for the realities of life out here, not just the ideals of life back east." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Reverend Clark sharing stories of other frontier communities struggling with educational challenges that someone with Eliza's background could help solve. Schools that taught Latin but not crop rotation, young women who could embroider beautifully but couldn't preserve food or treat illness, young men who knew classical literature but couldn't balance account books or manage livestock. "The frontier needs its own educational philosophy," the Reverend explained. "One that honors learning while recognizing the practical skills necessary for survival and prosperity. You've already proven you can bridge that gap." After Reverend Clark retired for the night, Eliza and Mackenzie sat by the fire discussing this new development. The territorial position would be even more significant than Mrs. Ashford's offer, carrying official authority and the potential to influence education policy across the entire region. "It's almost too much to consider," Eliza admitted. 6 months ago, I was cleaning floors in Blackwood's store. Now there's talk of me serving on the territorial board. Sometimes life changes faster than we expect, Mackenzie replied thoughtfully. The question is whether you're ready to embrace that change. The next morning brought another surprise. A delegation of local ranchers led by Marcus Flynn. They had ridden over together to discuss something they called a matter of community importance. Flynn served as their spokesman, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. "Miss Whitmore, we've been talking among ourselves about this territorial opportunity, and we wanted to make our position clear." Eliza braced herself for opposition, expecting them to argue that she was overreaching her proper place in society. Instead, Flynn surprised her completely. "We want you to take that position," he said firmly. "Not just because it's a great opportunity for you, but because the territory Needs someone who understands frontier life. Too many decisions about our schools are being made by people who've never lived more than a day's ride from a major city." The other ranchers nodded their agreement, and Daniel Morrison stepped forward to add his thoughts. "My boy James came home from the festival talking about his conversation with you. Said you explained things about soil management and crop planning that his schooling never covered. That's the kind of practical knowledge our young people need." One by one, the ranchers shared similar stories. Children who excelled at book learning but struggled with real-world applications. Schools that emphasized subjects with little relevance to frontier life while ignoring skills that could mean the difference between prosperity and failure. "We know it means losing you locally," admitted Jacob Sterling, "but we think you could do more good for all of us by influencing education across the whole territory." Their unanimous support was both gratifying and overwhelming. Eliza had expected to face opposition from the very people who now encouraged her to accept opportunities that would take her away from their community. After the ranchers departed, Mackenzie found Eliza in the garden, absently pulling weeds while she processed everything that had happened. He sat beside her on the stone wall that bordered their vegetables, his presence comfortable and reassuring. "They're right, you know," he said quietly, "about the good you could do for the whole territory. But what about us?" she asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her thoughts. "What about the ranch and everything we've built together?" Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the fields they had worked together. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally, "and I've come to realize that what we've built isn't just this ranch. It's something bigger." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Eliza, you've already changed how people in this county think about worth and capability. Imagine what you could do for the whole territory. How many young women might get better opportunities because you helped shape their education? How many communities might benefit from schools that actually prepare people for frontier life?" His words carried conviction, but she could hear the underlying sadness. They both understood that accepting the territorial position would fundamentally change their relationship, even if neither wanted to admit it directly. That evening, Mrs. Ashford returned as promised, accompanied by an additional surprise, Territorial Governor Harrison himself. The governor was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s who carried himself with the authority of his office, but spoke with the practical directness of someone who understood frontier realities. "Miss Whitmore," he began after introductions, "we're complete. I've come personally because what we're discussing represents a significant departure from traditional approaches to territorial governance." Governor Harrison explained that the territorial administration had been receiving complaints about educational inadequacies across the region. Schools were failing to prepare young people for frontier life. Teachers lacked understanding of local conditions, and educational materials were often irrelevant to frontier communities. "We need someone on the education board who understands these challenges from personal experience," he continued. "Your reputation for practical knowledge and effective problem-solving has reached the territorial capital, along with reports of your success in helping various communities." The governor's offer was even more comprehensive than Reverend Clark had suggested. Beyond board membership, they wanted Eliza to help establish a new territorial training institute for frontier teachers. She would have authority to develop curricula, approve educational materials, and oversee the preparation of teachers specifically for frontier assignments. The position would require significant travel, Governor Harrison acknowledged, but we would provide a permanent residence in the capital as well as accommodation for field work. The salary would be substantial, more than most territorial officials receive. As they discussed details, Eliza found herself both excited by the possibilities and daunted by the scope of responsibility. She would be helping to shape education for thousands of young people across a region larger than many eastern states. After the governor and Mrs. Ashford departed with a promise to return in 3 days for her final decision, Eliza and Mackenzie faced the reality that their time for deliberation was nearly over. "What does your heart tell you?" Mackenzie asked as they sat on the cabin's front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "That I'm terrified," she admitted honestly, "but also that this might be the most important work I could ever do." "Then, you have your answer," he said simply. The finality in his voice made her turn to study his face. "What about you? What about the ranch?" Mackenzie smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "The ranch will survive. I managed before you came, and I can manage again. But this opportunity for you, this is once in a lifetime. I won't be the reason you turn it down." That night, Eliza lay awake staring at the ceiling, finally understanding that Mackenzie was right. Her fear wasn't really about leaving the ranch or even about taking on such significant responsibilities. Her fear was about losing the first place she had ever truly belonged, the first person who had seen her worth when no one else could. But she also realized that Mackenzie had given her something more valuable than a home. He had given her the key, confidence to believe in her own capabilities. The territorial position would allow her to extend that gift to countless others who might be struggling with their own sense of worth and possibility. The next morning, she began making lists of everything she would need to document about the ranch's operations so that Mackenzie could continue efficiently in her absence. She organized her herb notes into a comprehensive reference that other women could use. She prepared detailed records of all the consulting work she had done for various ranchers, creating templates that could help future problem-solving efforts. But, most importantly, she began drafting her acceptance letter to Governor Harrison, knowing that in doing so, she was closing one chapter of her remarkable journey and opening another that would take her far beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. The woman who had been sold for $5 and dismissed as worthless was about to become one of the most influential voices in territorial education, proving that transformation was possible not just for individuals, but for entire communities willing to look beyond surface judgments to recognize true value. The morning Governor Harrison returned for Eliza's answer dawned crisp and clear, with frost sparkling on the meadow grass like scattered diamonds. Eliza had risen before sunrise, unable to sleep, and stood at her bedroom window watching the familiar landscape emerge from darkness. In a few hours, she would give an answer that would change everything about the life she had built in this peaceful valley. Mackenzie was already in the kitchen when she emerged, preparing coffee with the methodical precision that marked all his actions. They had spoken little over the past 2 days, both understanding that words couldn't ease the difficulty of what lay ahead. Instead, they had worked together on ranch tasks with an intensity that felt like storing up memories against future absence. "Nervous?" he asked as she joined him at the table. "Terrified," she replied honestly, "but also certain." When Governor Harrison arrived with Mrs. Ashford and a small retinue of territorial officials, Eliza met them with calm determination. She had dressed carefully in her finest clothes, not from vanity, but from respect for the gravity of the moment. "Governor Harrison," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say, "I accept your offer to serve on the Territorial Education Board and to help establish the Frontier Teacher Training Institute." The governor's satisfaction was evident as he shook her hand formally. "Miss Whitmore, I believe this decision will benefit the entire territory. Your unique perspective and proven abilities are exactly what we need to address the educational challenges facing our frontier communities." The formalities that followed took most of the morning. Documents were signed, arrangements were discussed, and timelines were established. Eliza would have 2 weeks to organize her affairs before traveling to the territorial capital to begin her new duties. Her first assignment would be a comprehensive assessment of educational needs across 12 frontier counties, a task that would require months of travel and evaluation. As the officials prepared to depart, Governor Harrison made one final Observation that would prove prophetic. Miss Whitmore, I suspect that your influence will extend far beyond education. You're pioneering new possibilities for women on the frontier, and that kind of leadership has implications we may not fully understand yet. After the delegation left, Eliza and Mackenzie faced the practical realities of her departure. 2 weeks seemed simultaneously too long and far too short to arrange everything that needed organizing. The first challenge was ensuring the ranch would continue operating smoothly in her absence. While Mackenzie was perfectly capable of managing the day-to-day operations, Eliza had become integral to the business side of their partnership. She spent 3 days creating detailed documentation of their systems, supplier relationships, and financial procedures. More complex was addressing her consulting work with other ranchers. Word of her territorial appointment had spread quickly, and several clients wanted to accelerate their projects before she left. Marcus Flynn requested an urgent review of his expansion plans, while the Henderson family sought her advice on establishing their own herb cultivation business. But the most surprising development came from Catherine Wells, who arrived at the ranch with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "Eliza," Catherine began, using the informal address that had become natural between them, "I want to establish a school for frontier women right here in the county. Classes in practical skills, business management, medical knowledge, all the things you've mastered. Would you help me design the curriculum before you leave?" The request represented validation of everything Eliza had worked to achieve. Catherine, who possessed every social advantage that Eliza lacked, was asking her to help create an institution that would teach other women the skills that had transformed Eliza's own life. "I'd be honored," Eliza replied, already envisioning how such a school might operate. Over the following days, they worked together to outline a comprehensive program. Unlike traditional finishing schools that focused on ornamental accomplishments, this institution would prepare women for the realities of frontier life. Students would learn herbal medicine, practical agriculture, business accounting, household management, and most importantly, the confidence to trust their own capabilities. "We'll call it the Frontier Women's Institute," Catherine declared as they finalized their plans. "And you'll be listed as co-founder and curriculum advisor, even while you're serving on the territorial board." The project energized Eliza during what could have been a melancholy period of preparation. Instead of simply leaving behind the community that had become home, she was helping to create something that would extend her influence and continue her work even in her absence. News of the Institute spread quickly, drawing inquiries from families throughout the region. Women who had never considered formal education began asking about enrollment for themselves or their daughters. The concept of a school that taught practical skills alongside academic subjects resonated with frontier families who had long struggled with the irrelevance of traditional educational approaches, but not everyone approved of these developments. 3 days before Eliza's scheduled departure, she received an unexpected visit from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, wife of a successful merchant from a neighboring county. Mrs. Thornton arrived unannounced, her carriage bearing the hallmarks of wealth and her manner radiating disapproval. "Miss Whitmore," she began without preamble, "I felt compelled to speak with you about the unfortunate precedent you're setting with these unconventional pursuits." Eliza invited her inside, curious about what had prompted such a visit from someone she had never met. Mrs. Thornton's concerns centered on what she saw as dangerous departures from proper feminine roles. Young women are beginning to believe they can pursue careers and independence rather than focusing on marriage and domestic duties. Your example is encouraging unseemly ambitions that will only lead to disappointment and social disruption. The accusation was delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions accepted without question. But Eliza had learned to respond to such criticisms with facts rather than emotion. "Mrs. Thornton," she replied calmly, "I've spent the last year helping frontier families become more prosperous and self-sufficient. The women who have learned practical skills from me have strengthened their households and communities. I fail to see how that constitutes social disruption. But you're encouraging them to believe they can operate independently, to think they don't need proper male guidance and protection, Mrs. Thornton protested. I'm encouraging them to develop capabilities that make them better partners and more valuable community members, Eliza corrected. A woman who can treat illnesses, manage finances, and solve practical problems strengthens her family rather than weakening it. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Mrs. Thornton presenting various arguments about the dangers of women overstepping traditional boundaries. But Eliza noticed something interesting in the older woman's manner. Beneath the disapproval lay a hint of envy, a suggestion that Mrs. Thornton herself might have welcomed opportunities to develop her own capabilities. After Mrs. Thornton departed, still disapproving but perhaps slightly less certain of her position, Mackenzie observed, "You handled that well. A year ago, criticism like that would have devastated you." He was right. The woman who had once absorbed every cruel comment and critical observation now responded to disapproval with confidence and measured arguments. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. The final week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Local families organized a farewell gathering that drew people from across the county. Unlike the Harvest Festival, which had been a test of community acceptance, this event felt like a celebration of shared achievement. Young women sought her out for advice about pursuing their own ambitions. Mothers asked questions about educational opportunities for their daughters. Men who had once dismissed her abilities now spoke respectfully about her contributions and expressed genuine regret about her departure. But the most meaningful moment came when James Morrison approached her with a carefully written letter. "This is for you to remember us by," he said, presenting the envelope with ceremonial formality. Inside, Eliza found signatures from virtually every family in the county, along with messages of gratitude and encouragement. The document had been organized by Catherine Wells and included contributions from people who had once viewed Eliza as an object of pity or curiosity. "To Miss Eliza Whitmore," the main text read, "whose intelligence, dedication, and courage have enriched our community and inspired us all to see beyond surface judgments to recognize true worth. You have proven that character matters more than appearance, that knowledge matters more than social status, and that determination can overcome any obstacle. May your example continue to light the way for others seeking to discover their own capabilities and worth." Reading the document brought tears to her eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had been sold for $5 and mocked for her appearance was being celebrated as an inspiration and leader. Her final evening at the ranch was spent quietly with Mackenzie, sitting on the porch and watching the sunset over the fields they had worked together. They spoke little, both understanding that their partnership had achieved something remarkable that couldn't be diminished by physical separation. "I'll write regularly," Eliza promised, "and I'll visit whenever my duties allow." "I know you will," Mackenzie replied. "But more importantly, I know you'll succeed in whatever you undertake. You have a gift for seeing possibilities where others see problems, and the territory is going to be better because of your influence." The next morning, a territorial carriage arrived to transport Eliza to the capital. As she loaded her belongings, books, papers, and a carefully preserved collection of herbs, she reflected on everything that had changed since that day in Blackwood's store, when Mackenzie had seen something in her that no one else recognized. The woman climbing into the territorial carriage bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had been sold like livestock 15 months earlier. This woman carried herself with confidence, spoke with authority, and commanded respect from people who had once dismissed her as worthless. As the carriage pulled away from the ranch, Eliza looked back at Mackenzie standing beside the cabin they had shared. He raised his hand in farewell, and she understood that while this chapter of her story was ending, the transformation he had helped her achieve would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and changing possibilities across the entire frontier. Territory. The girl who had been bought for $5 was riding toward a future where she would help shape the education and aspirations of thousands, proving that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary destinations. 3 years later, the territorial capital of Jefferson City hummed with an energy that would have been unimaginable when Eliza first arrived. The modest frontier town had transformed into a center of educational innovation, largely due to initiatives that had emerged from the Territorial Education Board. At the heart of these changes stood a woman whose influence had spread far beyond what anyone could have predicted. Eliza Whitmore stepped out of her office in the newly constructed Education Building, carrying a leather portfolio filled with reports from frontier schools across the territory. Her role had evolved far beyond her original appointment. She now served as Director of Frontier Education, overseeing a network of specialized schools and training programs that stretched from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains. Woman who walked the corridors of the territorial government bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had been sold in Blackwood's store. While her scars remained, they had become merely features of a face that commanded respect and attention for entirely different reasons. Her clothing was finely tailored but practical, reflecting both her official status and her frontier sensibilities. Most remarkably, when people looked at Eliza Whitmore now, they saw competence, intelligence, and authority. The physical imperfections that had once defined her were barely noticed at her destination. That morning was a meeting with delegates from the newly formed state of Colorado, who had traveled to Jefferson City specifically to consult with her about establishing their own frontier education system. The reputation of the territorial programs had spread across the West, drawing delegations from as far away as California and Oregon Territory. Miss Whitmore, Governor Harrison greeted her as she entered the conference room. "I'd like you to meet Colonel Robert Ashton from Colorado and Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, who chairs their Provisional Education Committee." The introductions were conducted with the formality due to someone of Eliza's standing, a far cry from the suspicious evaluations she had once endured. Colonel Ashton, a distinguished military man turned frontier administrator, spoke with the directness of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic complexities. "Miss Whitmore, we've heard remarkable things about your frontier education programs. Our territorial governor specifically instructed us to learn everything we could about your methods and see if they might be adapted for Colorado's needs." Over the next 3 hours, Eliza presented a comprehensive overview of the educational system she had helped design and implement. The programs emphasized practical skills alongside traditional academics, preparing young people for the realities of frontier life while maintaining intellectual rigor. The key innovation, she explained, was recognizing that frontier communities need citizens who can think critically and solve problems, not just recite classical texts. "Our schools teach mathematics through agricultural planning, science through practical applications, and communication skills through real-world business correspondence." Mrs. Hartwell, an elegant woman in her 50s, asked penetrating questions about implementation challenges and community acceptance. "How do you overcome resistance from families who believe traditional education is more prestigious?" "By demonstrating results," Eliza replied without hesitation. "When parents see their children successfully managing farms, establishing businesses, and contributing meaningfully to their communities, they understand the value of practical education. Success speaks louder than tradition." The meeting concluded with Colorado's delegation requesting detailed documentation of the territorial programs and an invitation for Eliza to visit their region as a consulting advisor. As they prepared to leave, Colonel Ashton made an observation that captured the broader significance of what had been accomplished. "Miss Whitmore, What you've achieved here represents more than educational reform. You've proven that frontier communities can develop their own solutions rather than simply adopting Eastern models that don't fit Western realities. After the delegation departed, Eliza walked to her favorite spot in the building, a small library she had established for education board members and visiting educators. The room contained books on pedagogy, frontier life, and practical sciences, but its most treasured section held letters and reports from the schools and programs she had helped establish. She selected a recent letter from Catherine Wells, who now served as headmistress of the Frontier Women's Institute. The school had exceeded every expectation, with young women traveling from across the region to attend its programs. More significantly, its graduates were establishing similar institutions in their own communities, creating a network of practical education that spread organically across the frontier. The Henderson sisters have opened their own school in Kansas Territory, Catherine wrote, using curricula they learned here. Sarah Martinez is teaching agricultural sciences to Mexican and Anglo families in New Mexico Territory. Most remarkably, 3 of our graduates have been accepted at Eastern universities, where they're studying to become physicians, something that would have been unthinkable for frontier women just a few years ago. But the letter that meant the most to Eliza came from an unexpected source. She retrieved it from her desk drawer, where she kept her most precious correspondence. The envelope bore the careful handwriting of Martha Sterling, the woman whose life Eliza had helped save during the barn fire crisis years earlier. Dear Miss Whitmore, the letter began, my daughter Anna has been accepted to the Territorial Teacher Training College you established. She wants to return to our community as an educator, inspired by your example of using knowledge to serve others. I wanted you to know that the kindness you showed our family during our darkest hour has borne fruit in ways you never could have imagined. Such letters arrived regularly now from parents whose children had benefited from the educational programs, from young women pursuing careers once thought impossible, from communities that had transformed their schools based on territorial models. Each one represented validation of the path Eliza had chosen and evidence of impact that extended far beyond her original dreams. Her contemplation was interrupted by her assistant, Margaret Foster, a bright young woman who had graduated from one of the first territorial teacher training programs. Miss Whitmore, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says he's from your home county and that you'll want to meet with him. Curious, Eliza made her way to the reception area where she found a familiar figure waiting with his hat in his hands and a warm smile on his weathered face. Thomas Mackenzie stood by the window, looking only slightly out of place in the formal governmental building. Tom, she exclaimed, her professional composure giving way to genuine delight. What brings you to the capital? Official business, actually, he replied, his eyes twinkling with humor. Though I have to admit, seeing you is the main attraction. They retreated to her office, where Mackenzie explained his unexpected visit. The county commissioners elected me to the territorial legislature, he said, still seeming slightly surprised by the development. Seems they want someone who understands both farming and the changes that have been happening in education. The news thrilled Eliza, not just because it meant more frequent contact with her oldest friend, but because it represented another example of how frontier communities were choosing practical expertise over traditional political qualifications. There's something else, Mackenzie continued, his expression growing more serious. Something I wanted to discuss with you personally. He reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document. This is a proposal that's been circulating among the county commissioners and some of the territorial representatives. They want to nominate you for a seat on the federal commission that's being established to oversee education in all the Western territories. Eliza stared at the document, scarcely able to process what he was telling her. A federal commission would mean influence over educational policy from California to Montana Territory, affecting hundreds of thousands of families across the entire American frontier. The Western territories are tired of having their educational policies dictated by bureaucrats in Washington who've never lived west of the Mississippi, Mackenzie explained. They want someone who understands frontier life and has proven ability to create effective programs. As they discussed the implications of such a position, both understood that they were contemplating another transformative moment. The local recognition that had begun with the Harvest Festival had grown into territorial influence, and now there was potential for national impact. "What do you think?" Mackenzie asked, though his expression suggested he already knew her answer. "I think," Eliza replied slowly, "that the frightened girl you bought from Jeremiah Blackwood could never have imagined such possibilities. That girl had the same intelligence and determination you show today," Mackenzie observed. "She just needed someone to recognize her worth and give her opportunities to develop it." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking on the office door. Margaret Foster entered with obvious excitement, carrying a telegram that had just arrived. "Miss Whitmore, this came from Washington," she announced, her voice betraying her awareness that the message was significant. Eliza read the telegram twice before fully comprehending its contents. The Secretary of the Interior was formally requesting her presence in Washington to discuss the proposed Federal Education Commission. The telegram indicated that her reputation had reached the highest levels of government and that serious consideration was being given to appointing her to a position of unprecedented influence for someone of her background. "Well," Mackenzie said, after she shared the telegram's contents, "it seems the decision about the Federal Commission may be closer than we thought." That evening, Eliza and Mackenzie dined at the territory's finest hotel, catching up on 3 years of separated lives. Mackenzie shared news from their old community, marriages, births, business successes, and the continued growth of the Frontier Women's Institute. He spoke proudly of how the county had prospered, crediting much of the success to educational improvements that had prepared young people to seize new opportunities. "People still talk about you," he said as they walked through the capital's lamplit streets. "Not as someone who left the community, but as someone who represents the best of what frontier people can achieve." "I often think about those early days on the ranch," Eliza admitted. "They seem like a different lifetime now, but they were the foundation for everything that came after." "You've exceeded every hope I had for you," Mackenzie replied. "But more than that, you've proven something important about the frontier itself, that out here, people can be judged by their contributions rather than their circumstances." As they paused outside the hotel, both understood that their story had come full circle in ways neither could have anticipated. The man who had seen potential where others saw only flaws had become a political leader. The woman who had been sold as worthless had become one of the most influential educators in the American West. "Whatever you decide about Washington," Mackenzie said as they prepared to part, "know that you've already achieved something remarkable. You've changed how frontier communities think about education, about women's capabilities, and about the kind of society we're building out here." 3 weeks later, Eliza stood on the platform of the railroad station in Jefferson City, preparing to board the eastbound train that would take her to Washington and another transformative opportunity. A small crowd had gathered to see her off. Territorial officials, education colleagues, and friends who had become her chosen family. As the train pulled away from the station, carrying her toward a future that would have been inconceivable just 4 years earlier, Eliza reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had been mocked as ugly and sold for $5 had become a nationally recognized expert whose influence would help shape education across the American frontier. But more than personal transformation, her story represented proof that in the vast spaces of the American West, traditional limitations could be overcome by those brave enough to look beyond surface judgments and recognize the potential that lay within every individual. She had become not just successful, but truly the pride of the frontier, living proof that on the American frontier, anyone could write their own destiny if they had the courage to seize the opportunities that came their way. The train carried her eastward toward Washington and new challenges. But it also carried the dreams and aspirations of countless frontier families who had learned to believe that their children, regardless of background or appearance, could achieve extraordinary things in a land where character mattered more than circumstances, and determination could overcome any obstacle. Washington, D.C. in the autumn of 1851 struck Eliza with its overwhelming grandeur and barely contained chaos. The capital city buzzed with the urgent energy of a nation grappling with westward expansion, sectional tensions, and the complex challenges of governing a territory that stretched from sea to shining sea. Horse-drawn carriages competed with pedestrians on streets that mixed elegant government buildings with ramshackle boarding houses, creating a cityscape that reflected America's ambitious but unfinished character. Eliza stepped down from the railroad car at Union Station, her traveling dress wrinkled from the 3-day journey, but bearing confidence despite the intimidating surroundings. She had exchanged correspondence with Interior Secretary Alexander Stewart's office for weeks, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of navigating the labyrinthine world of federal politics. Her hotel, recommended by territorial officials, sat within walking distance of the government buildings where her meetings would take place. The proprietor, Mrs. Rebecca Walsh, greeted her with the professional courtesy due to any guest, but Eliza caught the subtle examination that accompanied the welcome. Even in the sophisticated environment of the capital, her scars drew attention, though here the reaction seemed more curious than hostile. "First time in Washington, Miss Whitmore?" Mrs. Walsh inquired as she personally escorted Eliza to her rooms. "Yes, and I confess I'm somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of everything," Eliza replied honestly. "The city has that effect on most visitors from the territories," Mrs. Walsh observed with knowing sympathy. "But I've found that people with important business here tend to adapt quickly to the pace." Her rooms were comfortable and well appointed, with a writing desk positioned near windows that overlooked the bustling street below. Eliza spent her first evening reviewing the documents she had brought from the Territorial Education Board, preparing for meetings that would determine whether her influence could extend to the national stage. The next morning brought her first encounter with the federal bureaucracy that governed American expansion. The Interior Department occupied a substantial building that hummed with the activity of clerks, administrators, and officials managing everything from territorial surveys to Indian relations. Eliza announced herself to a series of increasingly senior assistants before finally being escorted to Secretary Stewart's office. Alexander Stewart proved to be a pragmatic man in his 50s, who had built his political career on understanding the practical challenges of governing America's frontier regions. He greeted Eliza with respectful formality, though she sensed he was evaluating her carefully. "Miss Whitmore," he began, consulting a file thick with correspondence, "your reputation precedes you. I've received remarkably consistent reports about the effectiveness of your educational programs from officials across the Western Territories." The meeting that followed exceeded Eliza's expectations in both scope and seriousness. Secretary Stewart outlined the federal government's growing recognition that traditional educational approaches were failing in frontier regions, creating communities unprepared for the challenges of Western life. "We need systematic reform," he explained, "but it must be reform based on understanding rather than theoretical ideals imposed from Washington. Your work in the territories suggests you understand this balance." The position they were considering would make Eliza the first director of frontier education for the federal government, with authority to establish standards and programs for all territories from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast. The scope was staggering. She would oversee educational policy for hundreds of thousands of square miles and influence the preparation of children who would shape the American West for generations. The appointment would require Senate confirmation. Secretary Stewart noted, which presents certain political considerations. Eliza understood the diplomatic phrasing. A woman of her background seeking such an unprecedented position would face scrutiny that went far beyond her qualifications. Some senators would question whether any woman should hold such authority, while others would focus on her humble origins and unconventional rise to prominence. "I'm prepared for political challenges," she replied confidently. "The work itself is too important to be deterred by conventional prejudices." Secretary Stewart smiled at her directness. "That attitude will serve you well in Washington. But you should understand that this appointment would make you a symbol as much as an administrator. Success would open doors for other women seeking similar opportunities, while failure would be used to justify excluding women from government service." The weight of such responsibility was sobering, but it also strengthened Eliza's determination. She had spent years proving that capability mattered more than appearance or social status. Now she had the opportunity to establish that principle at the highest levels of American government. Their meeting was interrupted by the arrival of Congressman Joshua Bennett from California, a vigorous man in his 40s who had requested to meet with Eliza during her Washington visit. Bennett's district included several frontier communities that had struggled with educational challenges, and he had followed the territorial programs with keen interest. "Miss Whitmore," Bennett said after introductions, "I've heard remarkable things about your work from constituents who have visited the territories. They describe educational innovations that could transform how we prepare young people for frontier life." The three-way conversation that followed revealed the complex political dynamics surrounding frontier education. Eastern congressmen often favored traditional educational models that emphasized classical subjects, while Western representatives understood the need for more practical approaches. Eliza found herself at the center of a debate that reflected broader tensions about America's Western expansion and cultural development. "The question," Congressman Bennett observed, "is whether we're going to impose Eastern educational traditions on the West, or allow frontier communities to develop their own approaches based on local needs." "With respect," Eliza interjected, "that's a false choice. Frontier education should maintain intellectual rigor while addressing practical realities. Young people need both critical thinking skills and knowledge that helps them succeed in their actual environment." Her response impressed both men, demonstrating the sophisticated understanding that had made her territorial program so effective. They spent the remainder of the meeting discussing specific educational challenges and potential solutions, with Eliza presenting detailed examples from her frontier experience. After Congressman Bennett departed, Secretary Stewart made his recommendation clear. "Miss Whitmore, I intend to submit your nomination to President Fillmore. If he approves, we'll proceed with Senate hearings." "Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" "I've spent my entire adult life being scrutinized," Eliza replied with calm determination. "The difference now is that I'm being evaluated for my contributions rather than my appearance." Her second day in Washington brought meetings with congressional staff members who would help prepare her for potential Senate hearings. These sessions revealed the political landscape she would navigate if her nomination proceeded. Some legislators would support her based on territorial recommendations. Others would oppose her on principle, and many would reserve judgment until they could evaluate her personally. "The key," advised senior congressional aide William Harper, "is demonstrating that your appointment serves national interests rather than merely regional ones. Senators need to understand how frontier education affects the entire country's development." Eliza spent hours reviewing economic data that showed the connection between education and territorial development. Communities with effective schools produced more successful farmers, entrepreneurs, and civic leaders, contributing to regional prosperity that benefited the entire nation. Her programs hadn't just improved individual lives, they had strengthened the economic and social foundation of Western expansion. But the most significant meeting of her Washington visit came on the third day, when she was summoned to the White House for an audience with President Millard Fillmore himself. The invitation surprised even Secretary Stewart, indicating that her potential appointment had attracted attention at the highest levels of government. The White House struck Eliza as remarkably modest compared to the grand government buildings of European capitals she had read about. President Fillmore received her in his office with the courteous formality appropriate to the occasion, though she sensed he was genuinely curious about the woman whose unconventional background had generated such strong territorial support. "Miss Whitmore," the president began, "I've reviewed reports of your work with considerable interest. Secretary Stewart speaks highly of your achievements, and I've received correspondence from territorial governors praising your contributions to frontier development." President Fillmore proved to be a thoughtful questioner who understood the broader implications of frontier education policy. He asked penetrating questions about the relationship between education and territorial stability, the role of practical skills in democratic citizenship, and the challenges of maintaining national unity while allowing regional variation in educational approaches. "The territories represent America's future," he observed during their conversation. "How we prepare their young people will determine whether Western expansion strengthens or weakens the nation. Your work suggests new approaches that could benefit all Americans." Their discussion revealed President Fillmore's sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics surrounding her potential appointment. He acknowledged the controversy it would generate while expressing confidence that her proven abilities outweighed conventional objections. "Miss Whitmore," he said as their meeting concluded, "I intend to support your nomination. But I want you to understand that this appointment will make you a pioneer in ways that extend beyond education. You'll be establishing precedents that will affect how the federal government approaches both frontier policy and women's participation in government service." The president's endorsement virtually guaranteed that her nomination would proceed, but it also clarified the enormous responsibility she would bear. Success would validate new approaches to both frontier development and women's professional advancement, while failure would set back both causes for years to come. Her final days in Washington were spent in intensive preparation for the nomination process. She met with legal advisors who helped her understand Senate procedures, policy experts who briefed her on broader governmental priorities, and political strategists who outlined the arguments she would need to address. But the most valuable guidance came from an unexpected source, former First Lady Dolly Madison. Now in her 80s but still sharp and influential in Washington society, Mrs. Madison had requested a private meeting, curious about the frontier woman who was challenging conventional boundaries. "My dear," Mrs. Madison said over tea in her elegant parlor, "you're attempting something that will require both intellectual ability and political sophistication. Washington can be cruel to those who underestimate its complexities." The elderly stateswoman shared insights gained from decades of navigating capital politics, emphasizing the importance of building coalitions and understanding that policy success required personal relationships as much as professional competence. "You have advantages that most women seeking influence lack," Mrs. Madison observed. "Your achievements speak for themselves, and your frontier background gives you credibility with Western politicians. But you must never forget that success here requires mastering both substance and style." As Eliza prepared to return to the territories while awaiting word about her nomination, she reflected on how her Washington experience had expanded her understanding of both opportunity and responsibility. The girl who had been sold for $5 was now being considered for a position that would influence American development for generations. The train that carried her westward toward Jefferson City also carried news that would soon spread across the frontier territories. Word of her potential federal appointment had leaked to newspaper correspondents, and stories were appearing in papers from California to Kansas describing the unprecedented consideration being given to a frontier woman for such an influential position. As the familiar landscapes of the American heartland rolled past her window, Eliza understood that her story had become larger than her individual journey. She had become a symbol of frontier possibility, proof that in America's western territories, merit could triumph over prejudice and opportunity could transform the most unlikely lives into extraordinary achievements. The confirmation hearings for Eliza's federal appointment began on a gray February morning in 1852, with Washington gripped by the kind of bitter cold that made even seasoned politicians hurry between buildings. Snow dusted the Capitol steps. As Eliza made her way toward the Senate chamber, accompanied by Secretary Stewart and a small group of advisors who had helped prepare her for this crucial test, the Senate Committee on Territories occupied an ornate room lined with portraits of American statesmen, their painted eyes seeming to observe the proceedings with historical gravitas. 12 senators sat behind a curved mahogany desk, their expressions ranging from curious interest to barely concealed skepticism. Eliza took her place at a simple wooden table facing the committee, acutely aware that she was making history simply by being there. Committee Chairman Senator Henry Foote of Mississippi called the hearing to order with formal precision. "We are here to consider the nomination of Miss Eliza Whitmore to serve as Director of Frontier Education for the Department of the Interior. This position would make Miss Whitmore the first woman to hold such significant administrative authority in the federal government." The opening statements revealed the political landscape Eliza would navigate. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois spoke strongly in her favor, citing testimonials from territorial governors and documented improvements in frontier education. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi expressed grave reservations about appointing any woman to such a position, questioning whether it violated natural law and social propriety. "Mr. Chairman," Senator Davis declared, his voice carrying the authority of his military background and political prominence, "while I do not question Miss Whitmore's individual capabilities, I must ask whether this appointment represents a dangerous departure from the proper order of society. Are we prepared to place a woman in authority over matters that affect the moral and intellectual development of our nation's future citizens?" Senator William Seward of New York responded with characteristic eloquence. "The question before us is not whether Miss Whitmore is a woman, but whether she possesses the knowledge, experience, and judgment necessary to advance American interests on the frontier. The testimonials before us suggest she has already achieved more in frontier education than most men in similar positions." When Eliza was finally invited to address the committee, she rose with calm dignity despite the magnitude of the moment. Her prepared remarks had been carefully crafted to address both policy substance and political concerns, but she began with personal testimony that captured the committee's attention. "Honorable Senators," she began, her voice steady and clear. "4 years ago, I was an indentured servant sold for $5 to pay a creditor's debt. Today, I stand before you not because of favorable circumstances or family connections, but because the American frontier rewards capability over convention and judges people by their contributions rather than their origins." The room fell silent as she continued, outlining her journey from servitude to territorial influence, while weaving in specific examples of educational improvements and their measurable results. She presented data showing increased literacy rates, improved agricultural productivity, and stronger community development in areas that had implemented her educational programs. "The frontier doesn't care about traditional prejudices," she declared, her confidence growing as she spoke. "A teacher who can't prepare students for frontier realities fails regardless of gender or social standing. A program that ignores practical skills wastes resources regardless of how prestigious its classical curriculum might appear to Eastern institutions." Senator Davis interrupted with pointed questions, designed to expose what he saw as fundamental problems with her appointment. "Miss Whitmore, how can a woman, however capable in domestic and educational matters, provide leadership to the rough men who populate our frontier territories?" How can you command the respect necessary to implement federal policy in regions where physical authority often determines social standing? Eliza's response drew on years of experience dealing with skeptical ranchers, territorial officials, and frontier communities. Senator Davis, I have found that competence commands respect more effectively than physical intimidation. When I helped save Martha Sterling's life during a medical crisis, the men who had questioned my presence began seeking my advice. When my organizational skills increased Marcus Flynn's ranch profits by 40%, other ranchers stopped questioning my gender and started asking for my assistance. She continued with specific examples of how she had gained acceptance and influence in frontier communities, emphasizing that practical results mattered more than traditional authority structures in environments where survival and prosperity depended on actual capabilities rather than social conventions. Senator Douglas seized the opportunity to explore her policy vision. Ms. Whitmore, if confirmed, how would you address the challenge of maintaining educational standards across territories with vastly different resources and populations? Her response revealed the sophisticated understanding that had impressed territorial officials. She outlined a flexible system that would establish minimum competency requirements while allowing regional adaptation based on local conditions and needs. Schools in mining territories would emphasize different practical skills than those in agricultural regions, but all would maintain standards in basic literacy, mathematics, and civic knowledge. The goal, she explained, is not uniformity but effectiveness. A Colorado mining town needs different educational emphases than a Kansas farming community, but both need citizens who can read, calculate, think critically, and participate meaningfully in democratic governance. The questioning continued for hours, with senators probing everything from her views on women's proper roles in society to her understanding of federal budget processes. Some queries were clearly hostile, designed to expose weaknesses or force controversial statements that could be used against her confirmation. Others reflected genuine curiosity about how she would handle specific challenges. Senator Sam Houston of Texas, himself a frontier veteran, asked perhaps the most crucial question. Ms. Whitmore, critics argue that your appointment would encourage other women to abandon domestic duties in pursuit of careers that conflict with family responsibilities. How do you respond to concerns that your example might undermine the social stability that depends on traditional family structures? Eliza had anticipated this line of attack and responded with carefully considered arguments. Senator Houston, I would argue that women who develop practical skills and professional capabilities strengthen rather than weaken their families and communities. My work has consistently focused on helping frontier women become more effective partners, mothers, and community members, not on encouraging them to abandon those roles. She continued by citing specific examples of women who had used skills learned in her programs to improve their family's prosperity and their community's stability. A woman who can treat medical emergencies protects her family's health. Woman who understands agricultural science helps increase her family's farm productivity. A woman who can manage finances helps secure her family's economic future. These capabilities enhance traditional roles rather than replacing them. The committee recessed for lunch, giving Eliza time to consult with her advisors about the morning's proceedings. Secretary Stewart expressed cautious optimism about her performance, while Congressional Liaison William Harper noted that several undecided senators seemed impressed by her specific knowledge and composed responses. You're handling the personal attacks well, Harper observed, but the afternoon session will likely focus more on policy details and administrative capabilities. They'll want to see whether you understand the complexities of managing a federal program. The afternoon session proved exactly as Harper predicted. Senators questioned her about budget management, personnel supervision, coordination with other federal agencies, and the political challenges of implementing uniform policies across diverse territories. These queries allowed Eliza to demonstrate the administrative skills she had developed while managing territorial education programs. Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan, a former territorial governor himself, posed particularly challenging questions about federal-state relations and the delicate balance between national standards and local autonomy. Eliza's responses revealed her sophisticated understanding of these issues, drawing on practical experience with territorial governments that few Washington officials possessed. The federal government's role, she explained, should be to establish minimum standards and provide resources, while allowing territorial and local authorities to adapt implementation to their specific circumstances. Rigid uniformity imposed from Washington ignores the diversity of frontier conditions and often produces programs that fail because they don't address actual needs. As the hearing approached its conclusion, Chairman Foote allowed Eliza to make final remarks. She used this opportunity to address the broader significance of her potential appointment while emphasizing her commitment to practical results over symbolic gestures. "Honorable Senators," she concluded, "I ask for your confirmation not because I seek to advance women's rights or challenge social conventions, but because I believe I can help solve real problems that affect the future of American expansion. The frontier territories need educational leadership that understands their unique challenges and opportunities. I have spent 4 years proving that such understanding produces measurable improvements in community development and individual achievement." The committee vote, conducted in closed session, revealed the political dynamics surrounding her nomination. 7 senators supported confirmation, 4 opposed, and 1 abstained. The narrow margin reflected both the unprecedented nature of her appointment and the political risks associated with supporting such an unconventional choice. Of the committee's favorable recommendation spread quickly through Washington's political circles, generating intense debate about the implications of confirming the first woman to such a significant federal position. Newspaper editorials ranged from enthusiastic support to dire warnings about social upheaval, while political cartoonists depicted everything from frontier classrooms to satirical images of women abandoning domestic duties. The full Senate debate on her confirmation stretched across 3 days, with speeches that revealed fundamental disagreements about women's roles, frontier policy, and the direction of American society. Senator Seward delivered a passionate defense of her qualifications, while Senator Davis led opposition arguments that focused on constitutional and social concerns. "This nomination," Senator Davis declared during floor debate, "represents a dangerous precedent that could fundamentally alter the relationship between government and society. Are we prepared to abandon the natural order that has guided human civilization for millennia?" Senator Douglas responded with characteristic pragmatism. "The question is not whether Miss Whitmore's appointment challenges traditional practices, but whether it serves American interests. The territories have endorsed her work with remarkable unanimity, suggesting that frontier communities value competence over convention." The final vote took place on a snowy Thursday afternoon, with the Senate galleries packed with observers eager to witness history. Eliza watched from the visitors section as senators cast votes that would determine both her personal future and the broader question of women's participation in the federal government. When Vice President William King announced the final tally, 28 votes for confirmation, 22 opposed, the galleries erupted in applause and protests that required the Sergeant-at-Arms to restore order. Eliza had achieved confirmation by the narrowest possible margin, but she had achieved it nonetheless. President Fillmore administered her oath of office in a private White House ceremony attended by a small group of officials and supporters. As she raised her right hand and repeated the words that made her the first woman to hold significant administrative authority in the federal government, Eliza reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. "Miss Whitmore," President Fillmore said after the ceremony concluded, "you now bear responsibility not just for frontier education, but for proving that merit can triumph over prejudice in American government. Your success or failure will influence how future generations think about women's capabilities and contributions. The weight of such responsibility was sobering, but it also energized Eliza's determination to succeed. She had spent years proving herself in increasingly challenging circumstances, and now she had the opportunity to influence American development on a scale that would have been unimaginable when she was sold for $5 in a Missouri General store. Her first official act was to send a telegram to Thomas Mackenzie, sharing news of her confirmation with the man whose faith had made her transformation possible. His response arrived within hours. "Knew you would succeed. The frontier is proud of you, and so am I." As she settled into her new office in the Interior Department building, surrounded by maps of the Western territories that would fall under her authority, Eliza understood that her story had become something larger than individual achievement. She had become proof that in America, particularly on its expanding frontier, anyone could rise to positions of influence and responsibility if they possessed the capability and determination to seize opportunities when they arose. The girl who had been mocked as ugly and sold for $5 was now responsible for shaping the education of hundreds of thousands of young Americans who would build the nation's Western future. Her success would demonstrate that the American frontier's promise of opportunity and advancement was real for anyone brave enough to pursue it, regardless of their origins or the obstacles they faced along the way. 5 years had passed since Eliza Whitmore took her oath as Director of Frontier Education, and the American West bore the unmistakable imprint of her influence. From the gold fields of California to the cattle ranches of Texas, from the wheat farms of Kansas to the mining camps of Colorado, a new generation of frontier citizens was emerging, educated not just in classical subjects, but in the practical skills and critical thinking necessary to build a prosperous Western civilization. The transformation was evident in the statistics that crossed Eliza's desk each month. Literacy rates in frontier territories had increased by 60%. Agricultural productivity had risen dramatically as farmers applied scientific principles learned in reformed schools. New businesses flourished as young entrepreneurs combined traditional education with practical training in commerce and industry. Most remarkably, women throughout the territories were pursuing opportunities that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. On this particular autumn morning in 1857, Eliza stood before a gathering that would have seemed impossible during her confirmation hearings. The first national conference on frontier education had drawn delegates from every Western territory and state, along with observers from European nations eager to study American educational innovations. The assembled crowd of educators, government officials, and community leaders represented the fruits of her years of systematic reform. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium, "when we embarked on this educational transformation, critics warned that practical training would diminish intellectual achievement. Instead, we have discovered that students who understand the real-world applications of their learning become more engaged scholars and more capable citizens." The statistics she presented told a remarkable story. Territory after territory reported improved outcomes across every measurable category. But beyond numbers lay human stories that illustrated the true impact of educational reform. Young women were becoming teachers, doctors, and business owners. Young men were establishing successful enterprises that combined traditional skills with innovative approaches. Communities were solving problems through educated collaboration rather than simply enduring frontier hardships. During the conference's break, Eliza was approached by Dr. Maria Elena Rodriguez, a young physician who had graduated from one of the first integrated frontier schools. Dr. Rodriguez now ran a medical practice serving both Anglo and Mexican communities in New Mexico Territory, embodying the kind of cross-cultural leadership that educational reform had made possible. Miss Whitmore, Dr. Rodriguez said, I wanted to thank you personally. Without the educational opportunities your programs created, I would never have had the chance to pursue medical training. Now I'm serving communities that desperately need health care, while training other young women to follow similar paths. Such encounters reminded Eliza Daly that her work had transcended policy implementation to become a force for individual transformation. Every letter from successful graduates, every report of community improvement, every story of someone overcoming limitations through education validated the vision she had pursued. Despite enormous opposition, the conference's highlight came when President James Buchanan himself addressed the assembly via specially arranged telegraph connection from Washington. His message was read aloud to the delegates, praising the frontier education programs as a model for the entire nation, and announcing plans to extend similar approaches to eastern and southern states. The success of frontier education, the President's message declared, proves that American ingenuity flourishes when practical training combines with intellectual development. Miss Whitmore and her colleagues have demonstrated that education should prepare citizens for the lives they will actually live, not merely for the traditions they inherit. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Thomas Mackenzie stepped onto the stage for the conference's final session. Now a respected territorial legislator and spokesman for frontier agricultural interests, he had traveled from Missouri specifically to participate in this celebration of educational achievement. I have the privilege, Mackenzie announced to the assembled delegates, of knowing Miss Whitmore from the very beginning of her remarkable journey. 6 years ago, I met a young woman whose potential was hidden beneath circumstances that had convinced others she was worthless. Today, she stands as proof that the American frontier's greatest resource is not its land or minerals, but its people, and that every person deserves the chance to discover and develop their capabilities. His speech continued with reflections on frontier values and the role of education in democratic society. But his most powerful observation addressed the broader significance of Eliza's achievement. Miss Whitmore's success represents more than individual triumph. She has shown us that merit can overcome prejudice, that capability matters more than circumstances, and that the American promise of opportunity is real for anyone brave enough to pursue it. As the conference concluded with delegates departing to implement new programs in their own territories, Eliza and Mackenzie found themselves alone on the steps of the convention hall, watching the bustling activity of a frontier city that exemplified the progress they had helped create. Do you ever think about that day in Blackwood's store? Mackenzie asked, his tone reflective. Every day, Eliza replied honestly, but not with sadness anymore. That day was the beginning of everything that came after. Without those experiences, I wouldn't have understood the problems that needed solving or had the determination to solve them. Their conversation was interrupted by a young telegraph operator who approached with an urgent message. The telegram bore news that would mark another turning point in Eliza's extraordinary career. Congress had passed legislation establishing a National Education Department, and President Buchanan was requesting her consideration for appointment as its first director. The first woman to head a cabinet-level department, Mackenzie observed after reading the message. From indentured servant to the highest ranks of government. It's almost too remarkable to believe. 6 years ago it would have been impossible to believe, Eliza agreed. But the frontier has taught us that impossible things become possible when people are willing to look beyond conventional limitations to recognize actual potential. As they discussed the implications of this new opportunity, both understood that Eliza's story had become inseparable from the larger story of American expansion and democratic development. Her rise from servitude to national leadership embodied the frontier's promise that anyone could write their own destiny through determination, capability, and the courage to seize opportunities when they arose. The telegram also contained a personal note from President Buchanan. Miss Whitmore, Your success in frontier education has convinced me that the American government needs leaders who understand practical challenges rather than merely theoretical principles. I hope you will consider bringing your proven abilities to this new national responsibility. Standing on those convention hall steps, with the bustle of frontier progress surrounding them, Eliza reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had been mocked as ugly and sold for $5 had become a nationally recognized leader whose influence would shape American education for generations, but more than personal achievement. Her story represented proof that the American frontier's greatest promise was not land or gold, but opportunity itself, the chance for anyone, regardless of their origins or circumstances, to discover their capabilities and contribute meaningfully to building a better society. As the sun set over the frontier city, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reminded her of evenings on Mackenzie's ranch, Eliza understood that her journey from desperation to national prominence was just one example of the transformations possible in a nation bold enough to value capability over convention and brave enough to extend opportunity to everyone willing to seize it. The woman who had once been sold like livestock now stood poised to influence the education of millions of American children. Her success had opened doors for countless others who might otherwise have remained trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Most importantly, she had proven that on the American frontier, and indeed throughout American society, true worth was determined not by appearance or origin, but by character, capability, and the courage to pursue extraordinary possibilities, even in the face of overwhelming obstacles. The frontier had made her proud, but she had made the frontier proud in return, demonstrating that its promise of transformation and opportunity was real for anyone brave enough to believe in themselves and determined enough to prove their worth through service to others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.